Welcome, listeners. I'm Mikhail, and today I'm pleased to introduce Professor Mary Uhl-Bien of Texas Christian University. It's widely recognized that infrastructure are central to societal goals, that changes to infrastructure and how we use them can have profound impacts on people and economies. It's critical to recognize that infrastructure are the hammer at the end of the arm, and the arm is governance. How are infrastructure governed and why? At the dawn of the Anthropocene, there appears to be a need to reevaluate how infrastructure are governed for the major challenges of the future. For example, sustainability and resilience. In a future characterized by greater complexity, it's necessary to ask whether the governance goals and structures of the past are appropriate for the future. Leadership is an essential part of governance. Today, I'm pleased to be speaking with Professor Mary Uhl-Bien on the topic of complexity leadership for infrastructure. We discuss what complexity leadership theory is, how she developed the work, and how it translates to infrastructure systems. Reassessing what types of leadership infrastructure agencies are capable of appears critical to their ability to innovate and handle disruption in the future. Here's my talk with Mary. Enjoy. I am happy today to be talking to Professor Mary Uhl-Bien of Texas Christian University at the Business School. And I think the best way to tell you about Mary is to give you a little bit of context as to how I found her and her work. So as many of you know, I was on sabbatical last year, and as we kind of referred to yesterday in the conversation with Thad, I became interested in this question of how do we govern infrastructure? And after doing some work on the topic, I think that the question was less about governance and more about, the bureaucratic structures and whether those bureaucratic structures are appropriate for the problems that we face today. So I felt that at the time we, and still know very little as, particularly as engineers, but I would say more broadly as infrastructure people, how we govern infrastructure, how we structure our governance organizations as bureaucracies, why they're governed that way, and what that form of governance or bureaucracy means in terms of what the organization is and is not capable of doing. So I started digging into this topic, and the way that I like to do that is by writing a paper, because that's my way of sort of self-motivating. And if I just am tasking myself with reading for fun on some of these heavier topics, I generally won't do it. So I say to myself, all right, I'm going to write a paper, I'm going to lead a paper, sort of thing. So after doing my lit review, there were sort of two key people that I found. The first was a gentleman named Mintzberg at McGill University, who in 1978, 79, around that time, early career faculty member, wrote about the structure, the basic structure of organizations. And he was very much writing this from a business perspective. But it was the sort of first, and my understanding is remains one of the only attempts to define like the molecules of an organization, and how when those molecules are organized in certain ways, the organization is or is not able to do certain things. So I found that to be a really useful way for me to sort of break down what an organization, or how an organization is structured and what that means. The other person, as you might have guessed already, is Mary here. And I came across her work that Mary, I think, was from 12 years ago at this point, on your earlier work on complexity leadership. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was sort of out of your PhD or shortly after your PhD. And I was reading a lot of work on governance of public service organizations, and just somehow happened to come across Mary's work on complexity leadership, which does not have anything to do with infrastructure, nor do I believe, again, correct me if I'm wrong, anything to do with public service organizations. So finally, I got the courage to send a blind email and say, hey, I like what you've written. Can I talk to you on the phone? And we had a nice chat, and we were excited to talk to each other some more. So I said, okay, what I would really like to do is get you in front of a broader group. And this is it. This is how it came to be. So Mary and I have not had all that many conversations around complexity leadership as it relates to complexity leadership for business or complexity leadership for infrastructure. So I think part of the conversation here today will be finding some common ground on how her complexity leadership theory can be applied to infrastructure. So I haven't really said anything about complexity leadership theory or complexity leadership. I'm going to leave that to Mary. With that, Mary, welcome. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I have to say, you said you sent me a blind email, but I was really excited to get it because, as I told you, I love doing interdisciplinary work. The complexity work has really allowed me, and the leadership work has allowed me to work with people across different fields and perspectives. And I always find it very enriching. And one of the enrichments I got was learning a new word, which is Anthropocene. Not sure I still know exactly what it is, but I get the idea of it. So I see we've shifted it to infrastructure now, and I'm excited about talking about this. And I will say the work has had some application in the public sector. So it applies, the work that I do is in organizations, so it can be any kind of organization. We've primarily focused on business organizations, but I have worked with different groups in different areas like military and some of the public sector. So I'll know about the PSOs, but I won't know as much about the kinds of things that you're doing.
Yes, and I think as you and I have discussed, it'll be interesting to see, how infrastructure might be the same or might be different from how we think about other types of organizations, right? And I think that's an important aspect for us for all of us to put our heads together on.
Yes.
Yeah, the Anthropocene is an interesting word. It is very well defined. There's a whole body of Anthropocene, scientists. There are journals focused on the Anthropocene, some that have Anthropocene in the name, some that don't, like Elementa, Science for the Anthropocene. And there's what's interesting is, scene is generally, a geologic term, right? But here it's become sort of a social term in some ways, or human evolution type term. So, it takes on a very different meaning. Mary, you're at Texas Christian, and let me start this off trying to get a sense of kind of who you are, how you got to where you are. So, I sort of started reading your work from around, I think it was 2008, one of your early papers on complexity leadership theory. How did you get into, I guess, complexity, and ultimately into kind of a business school, faculty member, and so on?
Okay. So it was interesting when you said this complexity work came out of my PhD, because actually it didn't. I'm a lot older than that, unfortunately. So I want to give you a quick background on it. So I started in the PhD program. I was recruited in by my undergraduate professor. I had not expected to do a PhD. I thought I was going to go out and change the world in global business. And it was the 80s and everybody was saying the globalization is coming. And I was so excited about it. So I get ready to go out and get a job. And I say to the world, here I am, I want a job. And they're saying, we don't have any jobs like that. So my PhD advisor said, no, I want you to come into the PhD program. So that's actually how I got into leadership. Is I basically then just joined and worked on his theory, which was leader member exchange theory. And that's about how managers and subordinates engage together. And the fundamental idea of it is that you have more effective leadership if you have a more effective relationship. So we focused a lot on the dyad, the leader and the follower. So I'm trained by an IO psychologist, which is probably the most micro you can get in the field. And I think I'm not really very micro. So I think my whole life has been then expanding out to the macro, but I have the good fortune of having this solid foundation in micro first. So that got me very much into relationships and thinking about interpersonal relationships, which are based on social exchange. So as I was doing that, I was understanding that leaders, the world that they operate in, is much more than this dyadic relationship, the manager and the subordinate. And in our field, we even do that very individually. So it's like a manager with an employee. That's how we approach it. And each employee is then different, and that's the basic unit. And I saw that wasn't what was how leaders operated in the world. So I was looking in the 90s as I was an assistant professor to try to find something that would help me understand more the reality and the context of what leaders operate in. And in the early 2000s, that's when I got introduced to Russ Marion, who wrote a book on complexity, and he pulled it from the physical and biological sciences. And it was a great collaboration because, like I said, I like to do interdisciplinary work. Russ he was a math and science teacher. He works in the education college. He's a professor. He was a principal for a while. So he came from an educational background. He was trained more macro. So again, I'm business school. I was trained micro. So as we would talk together, he brought a science background. I brought a very heavy psych and social psych background. And as we talked, it would just be such rich interaction and conversation. So that was how I got into complexity. We wrote our first paper. I was pretty excited about it, thinking that this had the opportunity to really change the world or change my world of how I look at leadership, because I knew that the world was complex. And we sit here in 2020 and we can say, yes, the world is very complex. We see it now, we're living it, and people don't have questions about that aspect of it now, that whether it's going to be complex or not. Now the questions are, how do we actually lead in that situation?
So can you expand on that just a little bit? So the world is now complex. You've said this to me before, and you've said things like, and correct me if I'm wrong, businesses have figured out or are starting to figure out how to deal with this complexity. So when you use that term, what in general are you sort of thinking about? And when you kind of say that about businesses, what are you referring to?
So again, this comes from the physical and biological sciences. So it's a very different meaning of what complexity is from how other people use it. So a lot of people have historically used the word complexity to mean complicated.
Yeah.
So the way we describe it, and I borrow this from Paul Cillier in Africa. He's from South Africa, and he was the first I heard use this, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So there are two things. There's complexity and complicated. So complexity is mayonnaise, whereas complicated is a jumbo jet. And engineers will get this. So a jumbo jet is complicated in that it has a lot of parts. And they're all intricately related and interrelated. But when the parts come together, they don't physically change each other. So it's decomposable back. So you can build a jumbo jet, but then you can decompose it back to the original parts. So the rubber never changes, the glass, the steel, those components stay the same. But mayonnaise is complex, and the reason is because it has rich interconnectivity. So in the interactions, when you bring the components together, they fundamentally change each other. They transform the other part, and that's called a phase transition. And when a complexity event occurs, it means that it's not decomposable back. Once it has happened, a complexity event, there's no going back to the former state. And so in terms of thinking about the world and how this works in our environment, complexity is characterized by rich interconnectivity. So the interconnectivity is those connections that we talk about, which is why I like this theory, because I was so into relational and relationality. So that made sense to me. But the richness is that it's the nonlinear interactive dynamics of it. So that when the components come again in an unpredictable way, they can transform. So as we were looking at this in 2001, we saw the world was becoming more complex. Why? Because it's more interconnected. So the more we increase interconnectivity, the more we increase the potential or opportunity for richness to occur in the form of a phase transition or a complexity event. And that's precisely what has happened this year in a pandemic. I don't have to say to people anymore, we're in a complex world. They know it because they saw the rich interconnectivity of the pandemic, and now all the transformation that has resulted in the fact that we are in a very different world now, and we can't go back to what it was before.
Yep. So the world is, from your perspective, more complex than it was, say, 20, 40 years ago, because there are more of these interactions.
It's the interconnectivity that's increased it, yes.
Yeah, we've written about and tried to frame the concept of complicated versus complex for infrastructure people. And we have used the jumbo jet example. That's a great example of complicated, right? Because if you don't know the definitions of these words, or you use them interchangeably like many people do, you say, okay, is a jumbo jet complex? And everybody says, well, yeah. And you say, well, it has millions of parts, but to your point, those parts are decomposable, and the emergent behavior, that is, when you push the throttle, the plane takes off, is predictable. It's
Yeah,
knowable.
that's it.
Whereas a city, for example, with all of its infrastructure, its governance, its people, its various behaviors, is arguably complex.
Right.
You hold a hurricane over New York City, for example, and you know that bad things will happen, but you don't know precisely what, when, where, and why. You can have some rough idea of what might happen, but you can't precisely predict. That emergent behavior is not totally clear.
That's exactly right. And the concept of emergence is core to this. So for people to be able to understand complexity and how to do this kind of leadership, you have to bring what I call an emergence mindset, which means that you're thinking and understanding from that perspective.
Yeah, I always sort of evoke the Cynefin framework, Cynefin, from Snowden at Microsoft, where there are other phases of a system, right? Simple as well as chaotic. And I think for us as infrastructure people, chaotic is also interesting to think about, particularly in the context of climate change, extreme events, which many
Yes.
of the folks here do, right? And then there's this disorder in between, which is shifting between those different regimes. So that's sort of the framework that I generally evoke.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so uh, you've been studying for a while now leadership in complexity, and sort of what have you been focused on? What have you been discovering?
We've had so much that we've discovered, and it's really exciting. And it's nice for me to be here at this stage of right now, especially in what's happening in the world, because we understand it so much better. So we started off with a theoretical perspective of how, if we bring complexity and we think about complex organizations, which is what you just brought up. So a city would be a complex kind of situation, just by definition. I mean, there's so many moving parts and they're influencing each other in such nonlinear and unpredictable ways, emergence events. So we started there, and then we developed a theory of how this would work in an organization. That was the 2007 paper that you were referring to. And from there, people were saying, well, write a book. And I said, a book right now? I need to go out and study this. So we went out. I was just not comfortable with doing more theorizing. I wanted to really get messy in the world and see what was going on. So we did massive data collection. We had a really massive research program. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to publish all of that because, as you know, the publishing takes time. So stopping, and my goal was not to publish articles. It was to understand the theory and the concepts. And so we just drove ahead. We had a research practice partnership team that did a lot of data collection and a lot of coding. And as we did the coding of our qualitative data that we gathered from organizations and from leaders, we had a practitioner who has a PhD who was on that team. That's Michael Arena, my co-author. And as we would code from the theory side, and luckily he knew complexity, we were deep into the academic words. He would say, well, here's how it works in practice, or here's how it works in the world, or this is what it means for people out actually doing this. So that was an unbelievable gift that we were given in this work. And as a result, we have very, very strong academic theory, but a very strong practice component that helps us to understand it. And then Michael got an opportunity to go be chief talent officer at General Motors. If you know anything about General Motors, and this is going to be relevant to what we want to talk about, what we know about them is that they died. They were an organization that literally died. They would have gone bankrupt. They were bailed out. So this is an important element, because a key part that you and I have talked about, Mike, around complexity and the difference with bureaucracy or the kinds of systems you're dealing with, is the motivating force underlying complexity is really the threat of survival. So it comes from living systems, from nature. And what we know is that systems are adaptive when they have threats. Well, in this work, one of the key findings was the most important threat was whether the organization will survive or not. And this is the big difference between the bureaucracy and the kinds of organizations and the infrastructure that you're dealing with, and the business organizations. So when I say business organizations have adapted and they're better at this, it's because they have absolutely the threat of survival. We see this right now in the pandemic, which ones are going to survive. And it's not even necessarily the ones that were most unfit, because the restaurant industry or chefs, I mean, they were well fit to their environment. They didn't do anything wrong, but the world shifted and it's now creating true existential threats. Some are dying. But in business organizations, the ones that have survived in this world and in this environment are the ones that have learned to be more adaptive. That was not an easy change for them.
Yep.
I have to tell you, I mean, it was a lot of bureaucracy busting. It was a painful process, but it has really resulted in a better situation now for all of us, I think.
So you and I were talking about like 3 weeks, a month ago, I forget what it was, but ever since, so we got to this mutual aha moment, I think it is, where basically I've said, like, infrastructure pretty much don't have a threat of death.
Right.
Whereas, business, for example, many other industries do. And that has resonated with me over these past few weeks. I've been thinking about, like, what does that mean? Is that really the case, right? Those sorts of things. I've been thinking about, for example, Uber and Lyft that come in and are they now providing service and are a significant disruptor that becomes a threat to survival of certain transportation agencies? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, right? But this has sort of resonated with me, and I think this is a key characteristic of infrastructure that might be a differentiator from the business world that you might focus on.
If we focus it on Uber and Lyft, what did they disrupt? They disrupted taxi drivers.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was funny because when Uber and Lyft started, I was thinking, oh, I feel a bit sorry for these taxi drivers. So I would try to ride in a taxi because I knew that they were being threatened and disrupted, and I felt bad for them. But I mean, after a while, you couldn't even get a taxi anymore. It wasn't an option. And now with the pandemic, that's really probably killed the taxi industry. So I don't know that we're going to see much of that back again at all. So that's the way this kind of thing works. The disruptors come in, and then the others need to be able to adapt.
Yeah. Are there, from your work, examples of private business that don't have a threat of death? Like the big banks are so, like, too big to fail.
The interesting thing is the banks, which you would think, I mean, if we had to predict back in 2001 which industry wouldn't change, we would think it would be banks. But oh my gosh, if you know anything about banking, they are completely transforming. So it's digitization and commoditization. Banks are no longer what they used to be. So I'll give you the example of that. My son is 25 years old. He's never stepped foot in a bank. In fact, my husband had said to him, mail me a letter. He said, how do you do that? I don't know how to mail a letter. My husband had to say, you go to a post office, you get a stamp, you put it in an envelope, and you stick it in the mail. I mean, he literally didn't know what that was. So he doesn't care about banks. He doesn't think about banks. And in fact, he was banking with Charles Schwab, and my husband's trying to tell him, how you deal with the bank. So that these younger consumers don't care where they bank, and they don't even care about a bank product. So that's it becoming a commodity. It's very difficult now for banks to differentiate themselves or even compete, because when something becomes a commodity, then what value does the organization offer? So they're in tremendous disruption.
Yeah, and from a physical kind of infrastructure perspective, I mean, it sounds like what you're describing is that your son now lives in a world where he is able to separate access to that service, what you might be calling the commodity, separating the physical infrastructure from the service itself, right?
That's
Like,
right. Yes.
yeah, and I see that. I brought up this story. My 3-year-old, who's able to go over to our Google Home device and say, "Play me a song," and can listen to any song in the history of humanity, just like that. Whereas, like, I used to have to mow my grandparents' lawn for 2 hours to get $12 to go buy a CD, right? And even that is a fairly modern story, right? Some people might say different audio mediums. So. when, we use terms like governance, leadership, or, we've used those terms, bureaucracy, and, those words to people who are not in the field, may not have all that much meaning. So I'm wondering, can you start us off how we think about differentiating something like leadership from governance?
So this is where I told you we would have some dialogue. I would definitely like to hear what you think governance is, but let me start here. So let's talk about what leadership is. I think the first differentiation we have to make is leadership from management. Management professor, so I get the management piece.
Yeah.
So a lot of people think that leadership is just management, and I say no, that's not right. So in our work, we're now understanding that you have to have different mindsets you bring to this. And the first mindset is what we're calling a top-down mindset to shifting to a collective leadership mindset. So the top-down mindset is that a leader person in a position in an organization that's a formal role, and that formal role has a leader, a manager, and a subordinate. So that's the basic way that people think about leadership in business. And so what I say to them is, yes, that's one form of leadership, that's managerial leadership. And in classic management theory, it's top down. So you have a bureaucracy. Well, what is that? That's a form of organizing. So bureaucracy is characterized by specification of offices, by formal reporting relationships, a hierarchy of authority, and division of labor, which means that people do different kinds of things. And that's all coordinated in an organization that is supposed to be for efficiency and effectiveness. So this is the key thing. Bureaucracies are set up for efficiency and effectiveness. What they are not set up for is adaptability. So in classic org theory, we talk about that from the standpoint of organic versus mechanistic. That was the 60s and the Lawrence and Lorsch and Thompson stuff. So there was organic is more like an organism, and mechanistic is more like a machine. And we always knew that. And then we knew that organizations have different component parts of that. All right, so that's the first way of thinking about leadership from the management perspective and from bureaucracy. But what's been happening is that now we think about leadership more broadly, and this has been happening over decades, that we don't think about leadership just as the leader in the position, the manager, and we don't think about it as just a behavior that that manager does, but instead a process. So leadership that I like to talk, the way I like to describe it for people is I like to break things down to the really most parsimonious definition we can give, which is why I say complexity is rich interconnectivity. Well, what I say is that leadership is using influence to create change. So it's a behavior, an influence behavior. Because it's influence, that means it involves power. And sometimes it's really difficult to differentiate leadership from power. It is the use of power, and power is actually the way that leadership gets done because it's influence. And then it's about change. So we set this part up to say that it's not just about efficiency and effectiveness in meeting results. That's more management. Leadership is more about change and adaptability. So some people will disagree with that. That's the way that I'm going to run with this. And then if we want to look at governance, governance is governing systems that we have. And so that's for particular kinds of organizations. And this is really where I want you to jump in. I think that's for more political or public sector kind of language, or in strategy, we talk about governance. So I have a colleague in business who does strategy work, and he talks about it as the governance of the organization, but he's really getting more at the structural elements. When he says that, he's talking about CEOs and how they interact with the board. So governance, I believe, is much more intended to get at the structural components of how organizations are set up.
Yeah, so, and by the way, some of the things that you just said evoke the conversation that I had with Thad Miller yesterday about infrastructure as knowledge enterprises. This idea of, how do you structure leadership, knowledge generation, and so on to be able to make sense of what is happening in the environment around you and change, ultimately change the direction of the organization.
When you say infrastructure, though, what it signals to me is I think about really the physical engineering kinds of
Yeah.
things. That and when I think of the word infrastructure, I automatically think something that's rigid and stable and not changing.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you just said. So let me try to respond to it and hit a bunch of those points. Yeah. So um, when I think about infrastructure, I think of it as having kind of three pillars. So the technical, physical stuff, um, the governance, which I'll get to in a second. I'll try to unpack that a little bit, and education. Which is not just me, as an instructor of, civil engineers, but also, for example, continuing education on the job education, right? Education happens in many different places, and hopefully for a long time throughout a person's career. So lots of different ways, but um, the challenge that we often think about is this rigidity that you're referring to, which I would in many ways agree with you exists. The question is, what does it mean, both in the physical assets as well as, and maybe more so, this is my concern and why I'm really interested in learning more from you, um, around the governance and leadership side of things, right? So we've had some discussion about rigidity of the physicalness of the systems. And, you could say, yeah, we instantiate infrastructure for long periods of time, one, because they're remarkably capital intensive, that allows us to hedge risk over the life of the asset. But, one, it sort of signals that it's going to be there for a long time. So sure, you can then build other things into it because it'll be there. Put a train line in, and we know it's not going away anytime soon, so we can do density around it, right? It signals that it's going to be there for a long time. But it's not just that, right? We can all of a sudden put in power lines under the road, and water lines and sewer lines and communication lines under the road, right? It becomes this really critical right of way, right, that becomes coupled to the point that you made earlier. So, that in many ways is good. The question is, right, as things change, is that configuration appropriate? And, can it respond to maybe the changing needs or changing conditions of the world or demand around it, right? So that's one. But then there's this rigidity in governance, which, okay, so what is governance from my perspective? And I think Tisha Munoz Erickson, who's a governance expert, is on. So Tisha, I apologize for what I'm about to butcher here, but I think of infrastructure governance as this sort of umbrella concept that includes a lot of the things that you said, but it's the rules, policies, norms, actors that are often contextualized within a bureaucracy and within a leadership structure that decide the direction of the organization, the system writ large, what it's going to do, why it's going to do it, and so on. And leadership. Leadership is certainly a relevant concept when you think about infrastructure, from what I'm learning, applying your theory and looking at how infrastructure systems work. So I'll be careful in sort of the broad sweeping assessment here, but it all signs point to, or many, let me rephrase that, many signs point to infrastructure in the United States being configured around what Mintzberg called a divisional bureaucracy. This idea that there's strategic leadership at the top of the organization. There's the chief engineer of the Texas DOT, right, Arizona DOT, and the chief engineer, with maybe a small board of people, are largely responsible for making sense of what is going on in the world as it relates to, in this case, transportation, and steering the massive ship that is the Department of Transportation to respond to that. And that form of leadership appears to have emerged with the railroads in the last century. And it was very much focused on, as you pointed out right away, this concept of efficiency. Essentially, it looks like Wall Street was largely responsible for configuring railroads in this way, right? Railroads were like a hodgepodge of different organizations for a long period of time, largely in the Eastern US. And as they consolidated and as they moved west, they needed to become more efficient, and they needed to um, be able to more effectively operate on larger scales. And they just weren't configured to do that, right? So Wall Street was like, okay, a bunch of railroads have tried different things, but it looks like this divisional bureaucratic form, which of course they didn't call it that, seems to be the most effective way of doing it. By the way, you can have all strategic leadership in one place, and that makes it remarkably easy to communicate with them and tell them, financially what to do and so on. So there's a wonderful series of books that was written by a think tank in DC in the early 90s, and the author escapes me. But the books chronicle how that model of governance or leadership, depending on what you want to call it, was transplanted into the emerging infrastructure systems that we largely rely on today. It was translated into water, into telecommunications, into power, and so on. So that's generally how I see it. Now, the other thing I'll add to that is what I also would hypothesize is that the way that infrastructure agencies try to deal with adaptation or emerging problems and their complexity is by adding more subdivisions into the organization, which, I'd love to hear your reaction to that, but doesn't appear to be the way to structurally deal with the emerging complexity of problems like sustainability, resilience, equity, and so on, nor the potential lock-in effects that keep us doing one thing when we may want to be doing something else.
Yes. Okay, a lot there.
Yes.
So I'm going to say in response to that, a couple of things that I take away, and then I really would like to, we can keep talking, but I want to also see if we can engage the group in the second part of this around this question. So here's the question I would have for all of you, which is how can we make infrastructure more flexible? So you said, well, we have the infrastructure. And then what I wrote down was it gets us locked in. I think what happens in infrastructure is it locks us in, it's rigid. And the question is, can you gain the benefits of what we get from infrastructure, which is all those things you described, but do it in a way that it's adaptive or flexible? So someone actually gave me the example of the buildings that are built for earthquakes. So you want to still have the foundation of the building, but that foundation has to be able to at least engage with the earthquake. And so a resilient building in an earthquake territory is one that has enough flex or enough adaptability. And I think the challenge is that what's happening in our world now is there's so much adaptation going on that it's a wider range than what we've ever seen before. So what we have seen in our work is that the key to doing this kind of thing, to making organizations, systems, people, for me being adaptive, is I need to have the right combination of the focus on the push for novelty and the innovation, along with the focus on results. And these two things operate in tension. So in classic org theory, they would call that the trade-off between efficiency and adaptability. And you're constantly dealing with that trade-off. What they then do is they say you need to balance it. But I don't think balance is the right word. It makes it sound like a polarity and you've got to switch between one or the other. And I don't see it as a polarity, because a polarity means that you can't be doing one while you're doing the other. I think it's a tension. And so there's a tension that we need to engage, and the tension between the need to push for adaptability, but then that stability that keeps us, we can't always be adaptive. We can't always be innovating. We need to have enough stability to be able to function and accomplish the things that we need. So that's the core challenge. That's the issue that we've been finding in our work and the fundamental dynamic, and I can speak more to it. But my question would be, how can you think about infrastructure and develop it in a way that it can be more flexible and more adaptive and not just rigid? And then the second thing I would say is that when you talk about leadership, I would say, no, what you described isn't leadership, it's management. So what was developed along with divisional bureaucracy was not leadership, it was management. They then called it leadership, but it's really not, because leadership is this broader concept that I was describing earlier, that it's not just the formal behavior of individuals who are aligning an organization around goals and results. Instead, it's a collective process of people co-creating leadership and followership together. So individuals engaging together in a partnership, and that partnership is a leading following dynamic of, if we're together, Mike, and we're trying to get somewhere, and a restaurant, and I don't know where we are, I'm going to say, I'm going to follow you, and then you lead and I follow. And together we've co-created leadership and followership that get us to the restaurant. But let's say you don't really know what it is, where you went, and you took us to the wrong place. You don't have a phone and I do. And so I say, okay, well, now I've got to take it over because I have the phone and I know how to use GPS. So I'll plug that in, and now you engage in following with me. It might be that I have trouble seeing how this works on my phone, and you and I together do it. So it's a mutual influence process. So leadership is a much broader concept. And people will say, well, that's teamwork. And there is an element of teamwork in it. The difference is we define teams as a unit that has a shared goal. And then there's not really the leadership dynamic, the asymmetrical influence relationship of leading and following. Okay, the final point I'll make is adding more subdivisions is a terrible idea. So we can talk about that, but that's just a really terrible idea.
So I was, when I was at UCLA last year, there was a talk by somebody from Los Angeles Metro, one of the third largest transit agency in the country, as measured by the amount of service provided. And they were talking about the point that we talked about earlier. How do we, form some sort of symbiotic relationship with Uber and Lyft? So, Uber and Lyft is going nuts in a good way in LA. Everybody's taking it, and we're worried that that's going to undermine transit. So, their solution was literally to create a subdivision, like a department, I forget what it was called, that was designed to sort of analyze this problem, interact with Uber and Lyft, try to find sort of strategic direction to be able to address this challenge. And that was sort of right around the time when I was starting to read your work as well as some of this other work, and I was thinking to myself, does that sort of subdivision or departmental sort of addition model lend itself to being able to deal with this sort of structural disturbance, right? This sort of potential major change in the conditions under which transit needs to operate. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. So let me say this. As soon as you say they create a department or a subdivision, that there's potential that could be okay, but it's what it implies. Because creating a department or a subdivision, my guess is they did it in a bureaucratic manner, and that's going to be too slow. So what we talk about today instead of that is more the importance of networks and collaboration. So I think that instead of thinking about creating a department for something, we want to create more fluid systems. So take the idea of a department. What's the point of that? That's to get an area focused, bring some expertise in, put some goals around it, and align people around some results. That's the bureaucratic way of thinking about it. The complex adaptive way of thinking about it would be more of a collaboration and a project. So more of a project task force that implies more fluidity and more dynamism. So a department could work if it was enacted in a fluid way, but my guess is that it isn't. So the whole thing is about fluidity. And I want to just differentiate what I mean by collaboration. Collaboration actually is a term, when I started looking at it with a doctoral student, it's a term being used in public sector more, and more for these kinds of issues. So it's really arising more in the area that you're working in. And the idea of it is that collaborations are fluid, dynamic, and they're based on network connections. If you've got something you're working on, you've got a problem you're dealing with, instead of it being, let's put this team and that team, and Mike, your team has these people on it, and my team has these people on it, and we're going to sit down in these meetings, and we have agendas, and we're going to have some goals, and we're going to drive toward them. That is a very, again, static and stable way of thinking about something. because those teams typically, as you get into the problem, aren't going to be the right players that you need once the problem starts actually being dug into. So instead of a team and a static unit like that, you have a collaboration with people who are reaching out and initiating relationships and connecting along the way. And the way to think about that is a network dynamic. So we're operating much more based on networks now and network connections, and information flows across the network. If you have the agents and the relationships there, you can activate those network relationships when you need them. But then I don't need to be working with you anymore, I need to work with somebody else, I can pivot over to be able to deal with that other person. So again, my problem isn't necessarily the idea of putting a department or subdivision, it's the implication that that's a bureaucratic thing.
Yeah. So let's pivot. So the topic of complexity leadership theory that you've created, and let's dive into that, which I think has a lot of really great potential when it comes to how we think about infrastructure. So I think if I think I'm remembering correctly, in your 2007 paper, there's a line to the effect of different leadership styles are important, but let's get real, and we're not gonna get rid of the systems and processes that we have right now overnight. They're going to be with us for a long time. So that line really resonated with me. Complexity leadership theory, I guess the question is, how does that differ from leadership theory or leadership more broadly? And I would love it if you can get into sort of the breakdown of complexity leadership theory, so operational, entrepreneurial, and enabling leadership.
Okay, so the interesting thing about what you teed up there and where you started was when we began this work. So Russ, Marion, and I were working on it, and I described that partnership to you earlier. We were struggling, and the issue was, we know that we have in nature what's called a complex adaptive system. And that's more like what I described to you, the dynamic, evolving organism that's reacting in response to the environment. And then we also know we have bureaucracy. And so we had this fundamental tension of, what does that mean? How do we engage those two things together? And that's what the 2007 paper was really digging into. And we had pictures in there where we had bureaucratic structures, and then we put our little casts. I don't know if you remember those pictures from the paper, but we'd have an org structure with the hierarchical triangle pyramid chart, and then we'd have these little circles of pockets of casts, or complex adaptive systems. And we were really thinking about it that way, casts embedded in bureaucracy. And then I had a doctoral student who, she's actually from Serbia, and she, I think because of what happened in that country, was naturally more of a complexity thinker, because she understood that when the world is changing around you and you're dealing with all of these horrible things like war, you need to be adaptive. And so she said, it isn't like this, Mary, it's the whole thing is the complex adaptive system. And so then we really started digging in, and we were able to draw a picture of an organization as a complex adaptive system. And that's what we call the three-circle model. So the three-circle model starts with the entrepreneurial. In the original paper, the names have changed, so I'll give you the new names. Mm-hmm. So it starts with the circle that's the entrepreneurial. And the story of this is that, and bear with me, this isn't exactly true, but just run with the statement I'm going to make. Let's not argue this, it's not worth it. But all organizations start out entrepreneurial. Okay, so an entrepreneur is somebody who sees an opportunity in the environment, has a new idea, and they're pushing for the idea, and they're creating novelty. Okay, but then as they grow, they have to bring on an operational system, which is also called an administrative system. That's what we called it in the first paper. So as they grow, they bring on the operational. Now, the operational is what we know as bureaucracy. So that's all the bureaucratic organizing that drives for efficiency and effectiveness. And now we've got the combination of the two. We've got the entrepreneurial with the novelty, the innovation, the new ideas, and we have the operational that brings the efficiency and effectiveness, that converts things into results, produces outputs that are critical for the survival of the system. So one without the other isn't going to work. But what happened then was the operational system ended up overpowering the entrepreneurial in most organizations and business organizations. Now, I will say infrastructure and governance, oh, sorry, somebody's texting me and it just dinged in, so ignore that. I hope he stops soon. So the infrastructure and the the in the operational or infrastructure is different, because I think that's where we have to talk about it. They don't necessarily start off entrepreneurial. So that's a question we can ask. Given that a differentiation that it doesn't start with novelty or an entrepreneur, how do we inject or get or bring in the entrepreneurial leadership? So that's a question I will pose for the group. So then the operational has all the authority and the formal power. And these two things, once you bring in the operational, they operate in tension. So there's the people who are pushing for novelty, the entrepreneurs, they want to keep going with that novelty. They hate, if they're a classic entrepreneur, they're going to hate structure. They hate meetings. They hate all that boring bureaucracy stuff. I love the ideas and the energy I get that is so motivating for me around the innovation and the novelty. These two things go into tension, and almost always in a formal organization, the bureaucratic is going to win. The operational system is going to win because that's where the authority is embedded, and they can overpower the entrepreneurial. So that then sets up this classic tension of how do we keep these things operating? How do we keep entrepreneurial alive in the face of the operational? And that's where we generated the idea of this middle space, the adaptability. It's the tension. The tension between these two things is the key. And what we found, long story short, in all of our empirical work is that the only way that this tension can work is if we allow it to operate in what we call adaptive space. So when pressures come in from the environment and the tension is injected, people are pushing for novelty, we can't let the operational system shut it down. That's what it does. We call it the order response. The operational system shuts it down, shuts down the entrepreneurial, tries to take the system back to where it was. That's the pull back to equilibrium. And it just gets rid of all the things that you need to be able to generate adaptability. So that's the basic story. I hope that's clear. That middle space is called the enabling leadership. And that's where you create the adaptive space to engage the tension.
So that is clear. What is the reason for why operational tends to push back on the entrepreneurial side?
Because that's the nature of what the operational does. Is first, again, remember they have the power and the authority, but they're also what you would call the infrastructure. They're the rigid infrastructure. So the operational is focused on efficiency and effectiveness. So the pushback they will give, for example, is you'll have entrepreneurial people who, if you let them run crazy, they're going to come up with all these great ideas and they want to go do something that has a really cool design. Well, the operational people will say, yeah, but we've got a budget, we've got schedule, we have machines that this won't work with. So their pushback is around the structure. It's primarily around the structural element. And that structure, if you want to think about the easiest one to think about, it's IT systems. So in organizations, the one that would be most comparable to infrastructure that you talk about, I believe, and you can push back on me, is information technology. It's locked in, it's not easy to change, it's critical, it allows us to produce what we need to produce, but making that flexible and adaptive is not easy.
So is, in Mintzberg's work, again, going back to like the molecules of the organization, as I call it, right? He had this, as you already pointed out, the organic versus mechanistic framing, which he might've gotten from somebody else earlier than him. But if I recall correctly, he advocates that during periods of complexity or in emerging complexity, the organization should tend towards what he called the AdHocracy, right? Which I think is a terrible term, but in his work, it was sort of describing these informal teams that would come together. You give them the resources they need to come together to deal with problems that the organization wouldn't normally deal with. Yes. Do you think about it in a similar way or differently?
So what he's describing is our original thinking in that 2007 paper. That would be those little pictures of the casts. In the pyramid, you have the little bubbles of casts, complex adaptive systems that pop up. That would be his AdHocracy. I think Mintzberg was very prescient and really understood a lot of things, but I think that it has evolved beyond that thinking. So I'm not sure the Mintzberg thinking is really beneficial anymore. Sorry, Henry, to say
That's fine.
that. I think it's kind of older. And the reason is because it was more premised in the idea that in organizations, when you have change, it's a change program. So the old thinking of organizations was, we have our organization, oh, we have a need for change. We're going to implement a change program. And then once that change program is done, we go back to our order. And that changed in the 90s. So in the 1990s, everybody understood that that's not the way you do change. Change is an ongoing, continuous thing. So
Mhm.
that's where it shifted to more of the living systems kind of perspective that I've been telling you about. And now it's shifted to where we understand that our organizations all together have to be living systems. And so they need to completely be set up around this idea of change. So the concept of AdHocracy wouldn't work. That it's really how do we implement or enable the adaptive process? I shouldn't say implement. How do we enable the adaptive process? So the thinking in our theory now, and I think others are thinking the same thing, is when you've got a pressure coming in from the organization or from the environment, and this can be internal or external, what needs to happen is that pressure is saying that you need to adapt. So you need to allow the adaptive process to occur.
Mhm.
And the adaptive process occurs when agents, which is people, ideas, information, resources, technology, activate and in the face of a pressure, and they start to generate novelty. So a new way of thinking, operating, they generate what's the seed of an adaptive response. And then for that adaptive process to occur, that novelty, that push for novelty, has to engage in adaptive space with the push for stability, because that push for stability is also critical for survival. We have bodies and systems that operate in certain ways, and they have to continue to function. You can't do something without that stability. It's essential. So it's the push for novelty, engaging with the push for stability in adaptive space. And we do that through what we call a conflicting and connecting process. So the conflicting is you engage the tension, but in that you can't stay divided. You have to find some way to find connections. This is the creative abrasion or adaptive tension. And this is where in that conflicting, you can get sparks of novelty. And so the skill, and this is really what I'm starting to teach leadership students, is the skill in that is not only how do you engage the conflicting in the right kind of space, adaptive space, but how do you capture the sparks? That's the fun part. The sparks that come off of that tension that then can generate the adaptive outcome. So you have the seed of an adaptive response that comes in, it goes into adaptive space, and if that's done the right way, then it sparks an adaptive outcome that gets formalized through the operational system back into the whole system and comes around in the form of new order.
So one of the, I think it was Tom Karp, who you might be familiar with. So I read some of his stuff on like change management. And, he talks about this idea of, people in an organization resisting change, or, to put that more constructively, how do you set the conditions for people to embrace change in an organization? And I think we lose this perspective often that an organization is people. And often lots of people, particularly when we're talking about infrastructure. So, when strategic leadership says, everybody now will care about sustainability, and in everything you do, you will have to think about and incorporate sustainability, right? There's this identity issue that is at play where, there are possibly many, if not most people in an organization that might say, I don't care about this, or, I care about it only as much as I need to keep my job, right? And, that is like a monumental force in, in making change happen. Does that fit into the complexity leadership theory?
Absolutely. And so this is really the question of resistance and how do we address or understand resistance when we're talking about these kinds of organizations or this kind of leadership. And this is where, again, I will say to you, that is a very, very real thing. And that resistance, there are multiple things. So one is the politics. So I always teach politics with this because politics are about interests. So when we are talking about politics, the basic thing here is that there are interests that people have, and political behavior is motivated by interests. Those are not always good interests. So you have to think about interests. That's the one thing. The other is that a system will stay in stability. It does not like to change. This is not a natural thing. And we as people don't necessarily like to change either. This is why it will only work if there is enough pressure that motivates the system to change, that opens up the willingness or the openness for change. And that's why I say you can't do this unless you're faced with true complexity pressures. Yeah, my colleague was thinking that in the beginning of this work, well, we just go inject all these things that introduce complexity in and that'll change it. But it's not true. You have to have a true complexity pressure. What happens with a true complexity pressure is it's defined by an adaptive challenge for which there's no known solution, so adaptive versus technical, by new partnerships, so complexity events bring people or agents together that haven't been together before. It's characterized by heterogeneous perspectives or conflicting worldviews, so you've got the conflict embedded. And then the fourth piece is the critical one, which is interdependence. Without this, you won't get it. And the interdependence, it's an old word, we've talked about it forever. It's the least sexy word in our field, but it's probably the most important thing with interdependence. And the interdependence and the complexity pressure means I have to work with you, Mike, and get this done, despite our differences and despite the fact that I don't want to do that, because if I don't, we're not going to survive. So that's the pressure that opens the system up. And what that does is when you've got a complexity pressure that comes in, it opens those things. We call that opening adaptive space. So adaptive space necessarily gets opened up. The issue is, what do we do with it? What most organizations did in the past is they shut that back down. They would come in with an order response, they would get rid of the tension, and they would fix it and just say, oh, we're fine, we've got to fix, this took us back to stability, we feel really good. So in business organizations, they found they couldn't do that. They tried. And where they would shut it down, go back to order, they'd fix, it's like a problem solving or crisis management approach, they'd fix it. But if they did that a certain number of times, they couldn't survive because they found themselves out of fit. So the difficulty with government or bureaucratic organizations or ones that don't have that real pressure is they can still survive. So they are designed and the individuals in them will resist. And that's, I think, the key thing that has to change.
Yeah. So that's, you know, again, since you've mentioned this concept to me, like whatever that was a few weeks ago, I've been thinking about it all the time, and you know, sort of trying to wrap my head around it when it comes to infrastructure. So, you know, the fundamental question, you know, do infrastructure organizations, are they threatened with death? You know, or you know, the possibility that they would be supplanted by somebody else. And I think there are some examples where I can say, yeah, there are the potential for disruptive actors to come in, and we've used these examples yesterday. But you know, for example, Uber and Lyft, right? So like your son, my kids, right? Like, you know, I actually I teach a transportation systems planning class to seniors that are, you know, around 22 years old. And you know, we got to the module where we're talking about you know, Uber and Lyft, car sharing, sharing economy, and so on. And it occurred to me, and I asked them this question: are any of you, you know, around the age of 22? Yes, there are some older ones, but did any of you grow up in your formative transportation years, like when us old people will talk about getting a driver's license and how that meant freedom, you know, getting your parents' car, right? But to them, it's wildly different, right? So, did any of you guys grow up in a world where Uber and Lyft were not major players at a time, you know, when you were becoming teenagers and wanted to go see your friends, that, you know, you couldn't access it? And the answer is no, right? Like their mentality around this service, which is not quite the infrastructure, right? It's the use of the infrastructure, but you know, their mentality around this service that is mobility and accessibility is very, very different, right, than anybody who is older than them. So, you know, there are infrastructure where I say, you know, the possibility of disruption or emerging and disruptive technologies, for example, water systems, water distribution systems or sewer systems, right? talk about not sexy, right? Sewage. It's hard to say, if they don't become sustainable or resilient, they won't survive and something will come into their place, right? I can think about, like, from our work, like climate extreme events. Like if climate change gets worse and extreme events keep reducing the reliability of these systems, will something else come in that's more reliable, that basically supplants that system? And I'm hard pressed to say yes. Certainly that is the case. But with other systems, again, like mobility, I could see Google or Apple or Uber and Lyft coming in and basically doing things differently. Amazon, even, right, with drone delivery, doing things differently that, to me, represents not simply the death of the existing infrastructure, and I don't mean simply the physicality of it, but more so the disruption that is new players coming into what was traditionally a single supplier and consumer market, right? Where new players come in that are able to control the system and control services in ways that public service was never intended to operate in. So, I think it's a really interesting question to think about.
I think in that example, the interesting thing, there are a couple of interesting things, and then I want to sidetrack to another thought that came to me. So public service, the difference is, so let's take an Uber and a Lyft. They have to be able to make profit. So they have to keep the system operating in such a way that they keep their organization alive. And we see that they get threatened. If you look at public transportation, they don't have that. They often operate based on an inefficient model that is supplemented by the government, right? So that's where you have government or others that are coming in and they're propping it up, an inefficient system. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have. So that's the difference between when people say, well, let's privatize something. When they're saying we want to privatize, what they're trying to do is get at the efficiency and the effectiveness again. They want it to operate like a business and that it's efficient and not losing money. But there's a trade-off there when you privatize, that there are people who will lose in that. And the big problem we have in privatization right now that I think is going on, and others can push back or can be controversial in the business school. A lot of what we find now with our capitalistic models is it's benefiting few. It's the winners in this are ending up being a few players and not the broader system overall. So it feels a little bit rigged right now, and it's played out in such a way, and there are a lot of reasons that that's happening. So that's the other reason that people would say we still need to have governance and public sector on these things, because there will be people who will lose, and we have to supplement and use our tax money as the revenue for that. But that creates a different model in terms of efficiency. And then I'm going to say one other thing about resistance, just to throw it in there. I'm seeing this in business organizations, but I think it's probably also happening in the public sector on the resistance of the players. So let's look at the people, the human element of it. And one of the big problems we have is that there are people who are older in the system who are running things, okay? And what they're doing is they're looking at it and they're saying, oh yeah, we see the changes there, we see it's coming, but it's not gonna affect me because I have a window. I refer to it as the window. I have a window, and my window is I'm gonna retire, and I have 6, 7, 8, 10 years. And I'm going to sit here and I don't need to do all this stuff. You guys can talk about it, you young people, whatever. I'm not going to focus on that because I'm going to keep this in place and ride it out until I'm gone. And the problem with that is, yes, they can do that and they have the power to do it, but the system itself is suffering terribly from that.
I had a professor in grad school that used the acronym NIMTO, not in my term of office, to talk about infrastructure leadership. If my, if the head of the, Texas DOT tells me I need to do something and I'm a division head, I'll do it, to a minimum if I am not totally on board, right? But NIM2 is a major guiding force in how I think about how aggressive I am in doing something.
It's a
Uh,
huge problem, a huge problem. It's an underlooked one. I think we need to talk about it more, not in this conversation today, but in general. And the thing about it is the reason that NIM2 has gotten harder is because these people, what is needed to change is so far beyond their thinking and their brains, they can't do it. So it's an existential threat for them. If they allow this change to occur, they can't really be the ones doing it. So think about the congressmen that were sitting when Zuckerberg and others came in to testify in Congress, and they had not even the basics of understanding how social media work. They've never done it. So this has then, the world has changed so much that these people feel, and they are, obsolete. And so then they're going to protect themselves by hiding their obsolescence by keeping the system where it is, which is not benefiting anyone.
yeah, which goes back to that identity issue, which I think is absolutely fascinating. A lot of Mary, a lot of your work, a lot of the work around your work that I've read, gets me thinking about. I don't want to say communication, that's not quite it, but like my strategy for how I advocate or recommend that infrastructure organizations change.
Yes.
So, I think there was, from my own perspective, I would describe a naivete to, how I was approaching change before it. Just sort of making the argument that, for example, if you don't adapt to climate change, your systems will be disrupted more and more. And, that's a big problem. So somebody's going to get fired. The reinsurance industry is going to come after you because they're not getting paid, however you want to think about it. But um, there's, I think, a much more pointed set of recommendations that we as infrastructure people could be making that leverages your work as well as the work of those around you around what it means internally to drive change from a lot of these dynamics, characteristics that we in the infrastructure community are often not aware of. I'll say from the engineering community, we're definitely not aware of them. There's probably other folks in this phone that are sort of broader infrastructure people that are aware of a lot of them. But it's got me thinking again of how we affect change. I'll also bring up this story that in November of 2018, which feels like a lifetime ago at this point, I ran an in-person conference. Oh my God, I can't believe I did that. That was about infrastructure sustainability. A lot of the attendees here were part of it. And the keynote speaker, this was in LA, the keynote speaker was Jared Diamond. And many folks here probably know Jared Diamond, who wrote a book called Collapse. He's written a number of other books, but it's important to think about the context here, which I wasn't fully grasping when I was listening to him talk. And I read his book probably 10 years ago. So Jared Diamond, for those who don't know, wrote this book called Collapse that describes, permit me a little leeway here, folks, how there is a rich history of civilizations, many, 1,000 years ago or so, that have exhausted their environments. They basically just exploited their environments to the point where they collapse. Everybody dies, or everybody just sort of migrates into different directions, and that society that was there is no longer there. So it was sort of a narrative that I took when I first read it, and sort of held on to it for about 10 years around how, if we are not careful with the environment that we have, our societies could collapse. And I still believe that in the most, in a meta sense. But I, in that 10 years, sort of read the work of Joseph Tainter on how societies themselves become so complex that they collapse. There's the works of Max Weber that talks about how bureaucracies become so complex that the institutions can collapse. There's the work of Sam Arbesman, or the book by Sam Arbesman called Overcomplicated. It talks about how infrastructure technologies become so complex that they become problematic. So there was like this series of books out there, or narratives around emerging complexity that leads to collapse. So I went back to ASU, and I was talking to my colleague and many of our colleagues here, Chuck Redman, who's an anthropologist, just like Jared Diamond is, and they know each other. And I was talking about this to Chuck, and I said, as an engineer, from an infrastructure perspective, collapse is unacceptable. Like, we do not allow it. We are trained to identify the many ways in which an infrastructure could collapse. We come up with, the mechanisms of failure. We identify the, top 2, 3, 4, and we design against that. We have training in how to prioritize against collapse. And he said, of course you think that way. You're an engineer. That's how you're trained. That's how you're taught to think. But from an anthropology perspective, collapse is natural. And this is not me saying that we should allow our infrastructure to collapse and people to die and all. No. I'm not saying that. But I'm just bringing up that sort of differences in perspective and the significance of that in sort of how we think about. If collapse is not an option, then what does that mean for adaptation, right? Given what you're saying.
So it's interesting. I happened to come across that book. There was an article about it. I read a lot of media, so I'm not sure where I read it, but there was an article about it describing exactly what you were talking about. And so I made a note to myself to look at it because I think it's an interesting avenue for me to explore relative to the complexity work. But my thought, and it came up in the article, my thought is exactly what your end point was, which is we view that when a society collapses, it's a failure. So, and if we look back and we say, well, we had this civilization and it failed, it died. But somebody either in the article or in the comments to the article said, yeah, but that actually just morphed into something else. So you want to say it collapsed or it died, but it just transitioned to something else and it's still there. It's just not in that same form. So I want to say that we need to think about that, the morph and the transition. So, and we need to think about how we view failure. I for many years, did leadership workshops for the Episcopal bishops. So if you want to find an organization that's challenged, it's religious organizations that are struggling with the changes that are happening in society around this. And so the example they'll bring up is a church, and they'll talk about a church that they need to close. It's a challenging issue for the bishops. And I said to them, yes, I get it. I get that your parishioners are unhappy, but it's not a failure. That church served its purpose. It did what it was supposed to do. Now it's morphing or transitioning into the next stage or next element. And I had the same thing with my colleague, Sonia Ospina. She had an institute, she was studying social change, and they set out to identify some goals. And she told me a few years ago that they were shutting it down. And she said, I just don't know how to feel about this. There are parts of me that feel like a failure. And I said, Sonia, it's not a failure at all. You set out to have a goal. You started an institute. You accomplished your goals. What's wrong with shutting an institute down? That's not a failure. So she said, oh my gosh, I didn't think like that. So we in bureaucracy and in a lot of our ways of thinking about institutions or structures think that once we put it in, it's got to stay. And that's not the case. So something shutting down or closing or morphing or dying is not necessarily a failure if it served the purpose. People die. So we add our life in and we die. So that's the one thing I would say about that. I think you landed in the right spot on it. It is important that we think more about that, the morphing and the transition, but also the language issue you bring up. So I spent a lot of time working with the leadership students or in leadership workshops on language and around communication. And when you were describing how you were speaking to people about climate change or other kinds of issues, it reminded me of polarity management. So this is Barry Johnson has a book, and it's called, I think I have it, I had it on my desk, it's probably at work, Polarity Management. So it's polarities and how you manage them. And when Barry was doing a workshop, he was paired up with me as I was doing the complexity work. And what he said is, we have these things that are poles. So centralization and decentralization would be a polarity. They're like opposite ends and seemingly incommensurable. And so I'm a person who would argue for, let's take bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, no bureaucracy. Let's just say that's a pole. So in me trying to say that we've got problems with bureaucracy, you have people who like bureaucracy, they're at the top, the plus side of the pole. What I then do is I try to argue, but look at all the problems with bureaucracy, so we need to go here to complexity. But what Barry says is don't go there. Don't go to the negative of the pole, because as soon as you go to the negative of the pole, you're questioning their identity, everything they know. It's a threat. It's a threat conversation, which is what you were describing. The way that you all have been communicating, or you've been communicating, gets to the threat. It triggers the threat response. If you trigger a threat response, it's going to be fight or flight. That's what people are going to do. They're not going to listen, or they're going to fight you. So instead, he says you've got to go to the top side of your pole. So the way for me to argue my complexity work is not to put down bureaucracy, but to show the benefits of complexity, and then show how you can link to it and try to get at the positive sides of each pole rather than going to negatives. And that is where we get to language, messaging, communication, the way that I'm bringing in a lot of negotiation work now for the interest part to talk about win-win. So we really need to frame things up in terms of win-win. We need to frame our pitches that we're making for something more. Instead of me telling you, you need to do this, I would do inquiry, and I would ask you a lot of questions to figure out where you are. And then I would figure out how I can link up what I've got with what you've got. So that's a lot of the leadership work around this.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on that partially touched on consensus building as sort of the mechanism that you need to negotiate in an increasingly complex environment.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I think that is one of the competencies that I often describe that our future infrastructure leaders are going to need. Building consensus is likely going to become more difficult, partly because the environment is more complex, but also partly because, and this is part of that complexity, people are increasingly coming to the dialogue with information and misinformation,
That's
right?
right.
And we can't be naive and pretend like that doesn't exist.
And you have to remember that there are political interests motivating that. So it's not just about convincing somebody on a rational level. That's not really where we are. It's not that kind of reasoning. There are people with motives, and I don't mean just politicians. There are people with motives that are creating information environments where they're intentionally putting out disinformation and locking against the other and creating polarities on purpose. So if we look at the politics of it, if we look at the Black Lives Matter movement that happened, the social justice movement this summer, it was starting to gain traction. And so what happened, the interests that wanted to stop that because they wanted to hold on to a certain party view, is they looked for language in that they could go to the negative of the polarity, the threat. So they pick up on that language that's threatening, and then they argue it to keep it in the polarity. They don't want to have a real conversation about the other side. They want to keep the polarity there because it serves their interest. So
Awesome.
keep that in mind.
Excellent. Thank you. So Mary, last question for you.
Yes.
You've recommended a number of books or resources. Is there one book in particular or reading in particular, outside of your own, of course, that you would recommend to the group here?
Oh gosh, I haven't been thinking on that level, Mike, so I'm not quite sure. I think the polarity management is a good one. Barry has some new stuff. He's been working on a new book. I don't know if it's out yet, but I would look up Barry Johnson, and Johnson, and he's got a website as well. Because I think polarity, you're dealing with a lot of polarities in the language, the communication. And then I think maybe something that would really help you understand the politics, the political aspect of what you're dealing with, because I'm not sure that you're taking that into consideration quite as much, the political and the interests, and then how do we actually communicate across those differences and the issue of power, politics, and communication.
Yep, great, awesome, thank you. A suggestion that I have, I see Cliff Davidson posted an MIT Sloan Management Review article, Sloan Management Review and the Harvard Business Review I find to be particularly helpful to wrap my head around some of the topics, Mary, that you've been discussing. So there's a lot of content there that goes back 40 years ago. That's actually where I found the Mintzberg stuff to start, an article of his from like 78, 79. But it's all very consumable. Obviously, they go through a rigorous editorial process to make sure it's consumable for the masses. And a lot of it has to do with management under conditions of complexity. They may not use those terms precisely, but that's essentially what they're talking about. And, there's probably 20 years of articles there on those topics. So for the engineers in the room, maybe check that out every once in a while.
And Mike, you can also, on that note, get a newsletter from McKinsey. So McKinsey, the consulting company, they have all kinds of newsletters, and they're writing a lot about this right now. So that's another one. You can get a free newsletter in your inbox, and it will just come in and you can read the articles.
Great suggestion. So with that, Mary, I'd like to give people a little bit of breathing room between their next 10 Zoom meetings. So thank you for joining us. I'm getting lots of messages on my phone and privately in chat saying, this is awesome. We need to talk to her some more. So you might get some follow-ups. But thank you again. I really appreciate the time here and your perspectives.
It was great being here, and thanks for letting me enter a different area. I always learn, so this is fantastic.
Glad to have your perspective. All right, bye-bye, y'all.